this is just an introduction to airbrushing class. One of the major things I think that's very important when you're starting out in airbrushing is that you want to make sure you have the right airbrush for the job or your particular application. And hopefully this class will kind of help guide you through your choices in airbrush purchasing that's available today. Something you got to keep in mind is airbrushing. It's not a graduating process. You don't buy one airbrush and then buy another airbrush and then buy another airbrush. The whole idea behind airbrushing is you want to find the correct airbrush for your application, and then from there you learn how to use that airbrush. So that being said, if you need an airbrush for one particular application but the other airbrush you have won't do it, you want to make sure you get the better airbrush and learn how to manipulate that airbrush to do everything you need to do. Because trying to learn how to use multiple airbrushes is a very advanced technique. So you definitely want to have an airbrush that will do everything you want it to do. So that being said, we're going to go ahead and talk about the different terminologies for airbrushing. There's 3 terminologies for airbrushing. The major ones are the action, the mix, and feed. Now action means what happens at the trigger of your airbrush. So when you depress the trigger on your airbrush, that's the action. Now there's 2 different kinds of action. You have a single action, which means when you push down on your trigger, that starts your airflow. And when you do that, your paint goes into the airbrush, so your single action trigger moves only up and down, and your fluid adjustment knob on a single action is either on the back or on the front. And that creates how much fluid the airbrush is going to take into it and itemize and spray out your pattern. The second kind is what's called a dual or double action airbrush, and that's what I have here. So your first action is you push down on the trigger, and then your second action is you pull back on the trigger for your paint. Now there's adjustments on dual action airbrushes. Right here is your fluid adjustment knob, so you can control how far your second action goes back, which controls how much paint comes out of your airbrush. So if you're doing something that only requires a little bit of paint, you're not going to want to slip and go all the way back and just have a bunch of paint come out. You can actually control how much paint comes out of your airbrush by adjusting that fluid knob, and that's more or less a stopper. So when you push down as your first action, you might have it stop here, and so you're not going to have so much paint come out of your airbrush, which is a nice thing with a dual action airbrush. The single action airbrushes are cheaper than a dual action airbrush, simply because there's not as many moving parts in a single action airbrush as there is in a dual action airbrush. If you're looking to spray, let's back up and go to the different types first of all. So there's 2 different types of mix when we're talking about airbrushes: an internal mix and an external mix for airbrushing. I don't know if you're familiar with the different kinds. Internal mix airbrushing. Is that coming up good? Yes. Mm-hmm. So internal mix airbrushing, what happens when you push down on the trigger, the paint comes into the airbrush and it itemizes and mixes, and that's what creates your itemization inside the airbrush, and then you spray the pattern out. On an external airbrush, that itemization takes place outside of your airbrush. I think you had one of those. Yeah. Did you have one?
Yep.
Yeah. So we can show you an example of that. Very nice. So here's a good example of what happens on this is a single action external. So when you push down on your trigger, your paint comes in, it doesn't enter the airbrush, and your air comes through and your paint comes through, and the itemization happens outside of the brush. Alright, so on an internal airbrush, that takes place on the inside of the airbrush. So there's 2 readily available external mix airbrushes, which is a Pache H and a Badger 350. I think are the most common external mix airbrushes that are on the market today.
And that's an H.
That's an H right there.
The difference between the 2, what are the advantages of each?
I'm going to get to that, John. I'm going to open up the floor for questions as soon as we get to that point.
Okay.
So that's your mix. You have internal mix and external mix. The next thing is you want to talk about is the feed. So we have a bottom feed, which is what this is. A bottom feed airbrush has different size cups that you can use. So if you have a large paint project, you can use a color cup. For smaller paint applications, you can use what's called just a small color cup. And it's just a friction fill on the bottom of the airbrush. Now, a lot of people get confused and they think, well, if I put this on here versus this, it all of a sudden becomes a gravity feed airbrush, but that's not the case. This will always be a bottom feed siphon airbrush, no matter what you hook up to the bottom. And the only drawback to that is it requires a lot more PSI to siphon that fluid from whatever cup you're using, whether it be a small color cup, large color cup, or one of the extra large color cups. It's going to require a lot more PSI, and that controls how you're going to use your airbrush. It's going to create a pace for you. So if you're spraying a lot of fluid, you're going to have to work at a faster pace than versus spraying at less PSI. So we have a bottom feed, a gravity feed, a side feed, and a dual feed. And this is just kind of a blown up picture of this exact airbrush. So, and that kind of just shows you all the different parts. Now, you wouldn't think about it, but an airbrush has a lot of moving parts inside. There's a lot going on in there. But the only thing we concern ourselves in the airbrush field is where the paint goes. That's the part we really need to worry about. So here's an example of a couple of different, this is a single action bottom feed external mix airbrush. That's kind of like what you have. This one here is more like this model, which is a bottom feed dual action airbrush. And on the front, you can see what I was talking about, how you can adjust your paint flow. This one here is another bottom feed single action external mix. And then we get into the gravity feed airbrushes. Now, gravity feed airbrush is a little different. Compared to a bottom feed, a gravity feed uses a lot less product to spray. When you these spray at about 8 to 12 psi. So you use a lot less psi when you spray through a gravity feed airbrush versus a bottom
Using
feed.
the other one.
This one here?
No, the one you did, the dual action bottom feed. What do you said 8 to 10 on the top feed, what on the bottom feed?
This one here is, the bottom feed is 18 to 20 psi.
So you're almost twice as much.
Yes, because what you're doing is you have to siphon that paint up through versus a gravity feed. Gravity takes the paint into the brush for you. And you use a lot less paint product that way. You know, you're not having to spray so much. So when you get into like single action and double action airbrushes, your single action airbrush would be more for larger applications. And if you think about like resolution on a TV screen, airbrushes spray dots. So the larger the dot, the less. You want to think of a dual action airbrush as being your high precision or your high resolution airbrush. It sprays smaller dots than a single action airbrush. So getting back to what I was talking about earlier, if you want to have an airbrush that'll spray smaller dots but is capable of spraying more to get you the large dots versus having two that do the same different things. So with the gravity feed airbrush, for example, this one here, the paint would gravity feed and it internally mixes inside the airbrush, so when you pull down, your air comes in, and when you pull back, your paint is allowed to go and flow into the airbrush. Itemization takes place and you spray out on whatever you're spraying. The other type of airbrushes that are available out there today is what's called a side feed, and luckily Doug actually brought one in. This one here is an older, what is it, testers that you had?
Model Master.
Model Master.
It's a forerunner of the Estimate.
Now these airbrushes right here, they kind of almost went away totally. They used to be used mostly for photo touching up. And the reason being why they put the cup on the side is so that when you're touching up photos, you could turn the cup up, and that's how they fix photos. And it kept this cup so you weren't spilling paint everywhere. Well, they kind of made a comeback because now with the automotive industry and the baking industry started using these side feeds. So when they decorate their cakes, or if they have to get in real close to do automotives, nails on women have them now, it keeps the cup out of your line of sight. So it makes it a lot easier. So these kind of made a comeback. I don't know how, you could probably use it in our application for doing like track work, if you're painting track that's on the layout and you need to be down, doing your marks down the railroad tracks or anything like that. This would probably come in pretty handy, and you wouldn't take the chance of spilling your paint on what you're working on. They work the same way as a gravity feed airbrush. It kind of gravity feeds the paint into the airbrush. So you push down for your air enters the back of this one. You have a knob for your fluid, so you can adjust how much fluid, and when you pull back, that gives you your paint. Okay, so it's very similar to any kind of dual action airbrush out there. It's more so like a gravity feed. All right. Here's another example of a side feed airbrush. And then there's also, which I didn't cover, and I don't have an example of, is Badger has an exclusive airbrush. It's called a dual feed airbrush. And what that is it's Badger exclusive, and what it does is it does both gravity and bottom feed at the same time. So you can have one cup here, and it also has a slot on the side for like a gravity feed. And it's Badger exclusive, nobody else has those.
Why would you want to do that? Just to...
in some applications that people are using, I don't know if it would be more for model railroading and what we do, but some people that do like nail work and tattoos and things like that, and you wanna switch positions, you could go from gravity feed to side feed. So it probably wouldn't be used too much for like what we do. So let's see. Oh, the other thing I want to talk about was what's called tip dry. If you've ever worked with an airbrush, your tip will end up getting clogged with paint, and it causes your paint to splatter, and it just causes some problems when you're trying to spray whatever you're spraying. So some of the things that happen when you're doing that is you always want to keep your airbrush clean. If you allow product to dry inside your airbrush, then you're going to end up with tip dry and clogging and things like that. So unfortunately in our hobby we use a lot of acrylic paint, which is a fast drying paint to begin with. So if we can use things like retarders in our paint, that helps with the tip dry and things like that. So you have, like, you go to the mall and you see these t-shirt painters out there, and you look at their airbrush and it's just a coated, it's a blob of paint in the shape of an airbrush. Those guys don't take their airbrushes home and clean them every day. What they do is they set it aside, they come back the next day, and they're pumping 50, 60 psi through their airbrush, and all they do is blast through those clogs. The reason why they can do that is because they're spraying t-shirts. It's a very porous material, it's very forgiving. So they can spray at 50 or 60 psi, and that material they're spraying on just absorbs what they're doing, and they can blast the clogs out of their airbrushes. Unfortunately, what we do, we can't really do that, or we'd probably end up ruining a model. So, right. So, we try to keep our brushes clean, and that's one of the major things that I can't stress enough, is when you're airbrushing, you definitely want to keep the product out of your brush. Because as soon as things start to happen in here and you get clogs and paint chips and things like that, it's going to adversely affect what you're spraying. Okay? So, John, you had a question? Any questions about different types of airbrushes, mixes, internal, external?
Internal and external. Where is the paint mixed again in the internal?
The internal mix airbrush, the paint is mixed inside. So what happens is your airflow comes in through wherever your air feed is on your brush, and it mixes inside the nozzle. Itemization of the paint and air take place inside the nozzle,
Yeah.
and then it sprays outside your tip.
What are the advantages of each or the cons of each?
The pros and cons of both of those, it all depends on how an internal mix airbrush will probably end up clogging and paint product will dry inside there a lot more than an external mix. Where you're dealing with parts outside of the airbrush, it's just more easy to clean, like with the one that Mel has here.
You look at that, John, the mixer's right though.
Where your paint mixes inside the airbrush, it's very critical that you keep the product from drying inside your airbrush. And it's a lot easier with an external mix.
Would you
to keep your
use
parts clean.
one over the other for certain applications?
Yep, a single action airbrush is for your larger applications, comes back to those dots I was talking about.
But I
A
mean-
single action airbrush creates large dots.
But I mean, internal versus external. Would you use one for one application?
What you'd want to do is manipulate your dual action to do what a single action does.
Okay.
Unless your budget allows for 2 airbrushes, which is, you can do that. There's nothing wrong with getting multiple airbrushes, but there's really no need.
Is a single action an internal?
It can be both.
Can be both, okay.
Yeah.
No, I was just curious as to what you would prefer to use for a certain application, an external versus an internal, or does it make any difference? Other than it clogging up and stuff like that.
Most of your external airbrushes will not clog as much as an internal airbrush
Right.
will.
Right.
So I'm not really sure what you're getting at here.
Well, okay, you got an internal mix,
Yeah.
an external mix. Would you use one over the other for a certain application? Or would it make any difference?
It wouldn't really make a difference. I mean, you
Okay.
can use a dual action airbrush to do exactly the same thing a single action does.
Okay. Why the difference then?
It all depends. In our hobby, it depends on what you're spraying. You could use a single action airbrush to spray larger applications like terrain, buildings, things like that. And this is more of a precision airbrush. Now you can get this airbrush to do exactly the same thing as a single action airbrush does. You just have to spray more.
Okay, I don't think you're, I know the difference between a single and a
Okay.
double action, but it's the internal versus the external. Would you have a certain application that you would use an external mix versus an internal mix? Or would you just do the same thing? And, why the difference if the paint mixes inside or outside?
The external is a lot easier to use.
Okay. There you go. Thank you.
Okay.
Plus, they sell one for, there's actually a small mini, what do you call it? Sandblaster. It is an external mix. I mean, you couldn't do it. I have one question. You keep saying clean, clean, clean. And this is the one thing I've heard is the one, a lot of people don't like internal mix because of this factor. Now, when we were down in Springfield, they had a little thing with, you go down and the guy will show you how to, and they had a top feed internal mix, double action. And of course, that was easy because all you had to do was take a little cleaner, drop it in your, slosh it around in your, what do you call that? You just call it a cup.
Yeah.
And bingo, you're done. You can do the same thing, obviously, with a bottom feed. You could do it with any feed. Clean it out.
Yes. When we spray acrylics in this hobby, and what we do, where we spray mostly acrylics, you want to have a bottle of cleaner and something to get that cleaner into your brush readily available, like right next to you. As soon as
That's
that,
another cup.
yeah, I mean, they make all kinds of different things on the market. I've seen the big bottles that clean your airbrush. You stick your airbrush in, you spray it, it back flushes your airbrush. I mean, there's all kinds of neat little gadgets out there. Personally, what I do is I'm going to cover some cleaning techniques here in a little bit, but my cleaning solution, I just use one of these little pipettes, put that in, lay this down, and I just insert this right here, and I spray the cleaner, and that's all you need to do. And then I use a Q-tip, and I clean the tip out, and then I'm ready. I just clean that product out, and I put the paint on, and I'm ready to spray. So you can go and get all these, cups and gadgets and self-cleaning tools. I mean, I'm sure there's all kinds of them out there. But you can get just something that costs pennies, you know, and Windex, and it'll do the same job. So, but that's one of the biggest things. Like I said, I can't stress enough on keeping these things clean. Is there any other questions?
So Windex can be used as a cleaner.
Yes, that's what I use. And the reason being is you want to have something with an ammonia base to it, because ammonia is what breaks down acrylic paint. So I use Windex, and I've been using it for quite a while, and it works extremely well.
Otherwise, don't use the alcohol that you use to thin the paint with.
Well, you don't want to use alcohol to clean your airbrush anyway, because that quickens the drying process of acrylic.
Yeah, I go say.
And so, if you're trying to get it out of your airbrush and then using alcohol to dry it quicker, then you might be in trouble.
You're smelling it in.
Yeah.
Use a flow coat or something like that, then you can use the alcohol.
Sure. I don't know what, you know, it's fine.
Polyester is the acrylic version, is it not?
I'm sorry, what?
Polyester is the acrylic version of most flow paints.
This stuff?
That's the oil, the petroleum base.
Yeah, I don't have any of the
There
polyester
you go,
stuff, right?
Polyester, yeah,
This one?
Yeah.
Oh, that's acrylic based.
Yeah.
yeah.
Yes.
The flow being the oil base, and polyester is the acrylic.
Yeah. And for what we do, acrylic works really well. It's a fast drying paint. Unless you get into some locomotive painting and stuff like that, where you want a nice shiny coat to apply decals to, all your acrylics pretty much spray dull, and then you need to shine them with something to lay decals on them. So, you know, if you're doing anything like that, I'm going to get into some paint stuff here in a little bit, but for advanced airbrushers, give this a shot. But for beginners, this could become very frustrating, especially when it comes to the point of trying to clean it out of your airbrush. And you're not sure exactly what to use to get it out. A lot of this stuff requires like mineral spirits to get out, things like that, or lacquer thinner. When you start dealing with that stuff, and if you're down in your basement or in a confined area, you could be in trouble. This stuff's pretty strong. So it's nice working with acrylics. They're very easy on us, and what we clean them with isn't really that volatile. So. The next thing, I guess, what we can get into is supplying air to these tools. So we have a few different options there as far as how we can supply air to our airbrush. One of the...
New updates.
Oh, great.
That's what you wanted?
Thanks for letting me know. All right, so the different kind of air sources, we have what's called Propel, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. It's a can of air. We have inert gases, like CO2 is one of the, if not the more popular one. We have storage tanks, and we have compressors. So Propel comes in different size bottles. I'm not sure the ounces. They come in starter kits like what you have, you know. Not recommended unless you're a beginner. You're 13, 15, 16, 18 years old, and you've got a first airbrush kit, and it comes all with everything in there, and it's something to learn. It's great. The problem with Propel is that as soon as you start to use it,
The pressure goes down.
your pressure starts to go down. You don't have a constant flow of air with a Propel air tank.
And it gets cold.
And it gets extremely cold and causes condensation issues sometimes. But once it gets really cold, like frost creates on the outside of the can. So those, this is what they look like. And like I said, if you have something small that you want to paint, great, you know, use them. I've graduated beyond Propel cans, and I'm sure a lot of us probably have already too. The next thing is like inert gases, like I talked about. You can go and fill up one of these tanks. They come in all kinds of different sizes. Anywhere from 20-pound fire extinguisher size down to, you know, 2.5 pounds. And they're great. They usually come with some kind of regulator airflow valve on them.
But they have a strange...
The drawback to them is they can get kind of expensive. You gotta throw them in your vehicle and go get them filled from time to time. I've never used them personally, but they are a constant clean flow of air, so it is an option.
What kind of PSI are those?
Well, like I said, they're regulators. So when you're spraying through an airbrush, you want to go in there from 8 to 20 psi. You know, you could probably pump these up and fill up your air and your tires with them. You know, so I wouldn't recommend putting that much pressure through an airbrush. the other things are these air tanks. Exactly. I mean, that's all it is. They do come with an air regulator on them. You can control the air coming out. You can get these at like Home Depot, Lowe's. They're pretty cheap. Throw it under your bench, but you'd still have to go get them filled. You know, so the way to fill these, if you have a little compressor, you know, you could always fill it up and go with that. It just becomes a compressor to fill it, and this is your tank of air. You can buy a compressor, yeah, and it's very quiet.
Very quiet.
Yeah, so if you live in an apartment, you don't want to disturb your neighbors, maybe go with something like this. And then compressors are probably one of the best ways to get air to your airbrush. They've come a long way over the years. Any kind of compressor, it doesn't have to be a Badger airbrush compressor, it doesn't have to be a Wada, it doesn't have to be matched, unless you want to match them. Some people like doing that. You want to get a Badger airbrush and you have a Badger compressor to go with it, that's great. But you got to keep in mind that the airbrush companies don't make compressors. They endorse the compressors and put their names on them, but they're not in the business to make compressors, they make airbrushes. So you can go to Michael's, sometimes they have 50% off sales there, coupons all the time, you get them in the newspaper, you can get a compressor pretty cheap. As long as you get a compressor that sprays at least 30 psi, you'll be able to do anything with it as far as airbrushing goes. So there's a lot of different options out there. This one has dual diaphragm. This is just a pretty standard, kind of like the one I have here. They're pretty small. They got little suction cups so it doesn't walk away on you and fall off the bench. I've had this airbrush compressor now for probably 8 or 9 years. It's a diaphragm airbrush. It's a little loud, but nowadays when you buy a diaphragm style compressor, they've worked it out where they've manufactured these quieter. They're not so loud. You can get into like something that you need to oil all the time, and that's what kept the silent running compressors, I think they're called. You'd have to oil those. It's not really necessary for airbrushing. When you get into diaphragm style airbrushes, they've manufactured that quietness right into them now. So if you are in an apartment or you don't want to disturb your neighbors or anything like that.
The oil, you go better keep them level too.
Yep, these are pretty quiet. You know, pretty quiet. It also depends on what surface you put this on. If you put it on a concrete surface and I turn this on, it doesn't drown me out whatsoever. You know, it's pretty quiet. They're even quieter now. Like I said, this one's eight years old and still going strong. I haven't done nothing to it, you know. And it's a nice constant flow of air. You can also get into compressors that have storage tanks on them. That really helps drop down the wear and tear on your compressor. It doesn't have to run constantly. So we have frequent and infrequent users is what it boils down to. If you're the type of person that has an airbrush and you use it once a month or once every 6 months, you probably wouldn't need to spend a lot of money with a compressor and a tank, and you know, go get just an air bottle if that's all you know. You know, if you're a very infrequent user, you don't need to spend lots of money on something that's going to sit in your closet. Now, if you're a frequent user, I'd consider myself a frequent user. I airbrush maybe once or twice a week. I'm always working on something, and I have a diaphragm compressor. Sits down in my basement next to an airbrush booth that I built, and I use it all the time. And it doesn't. It is, you know, it doesn't really bother me, but I can see how some people might not like the noise. So if you don't like the noise of your compressor running all the time, get something with a tank on it. Nice thing about a tank is it also acts as a secondary moisture trap, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Around here, only certain times of the year with the high humidity, you'd have to worry about having a moisture trap on an airbrush. On a day like today where it's so dry out, probably not going to create a lot of moisture when you're airbrushing. You know, if you live in Miami, Florida, you probably want three moisture traps in a row right down the line. But yeah, so it all depends on how much you use your airbrush, is whether or not you want to spend a lot of money. Yeah, look at this monster.
What about a dual service
Yeah,
compressor?
you fill up truck tires with that.
Why don't you hold that up, Doug? Don?
Now this is a good example of overkill. Everything.
Overkill's what I
You're
Blow
right.
up hot air balloons with it.
60-gallon stand
No,
up.
you can do that with a
60
propane
gallons,
tank.
stand up, but it cycles once while you're doing the whole thing with the airbrush.
Yes, I mean you can buy monstrous tanks and get them piped down to 8 psi. Great. I mean, is it necessary? Not really. Not for airbrushing. But if you're going to use this thing for other applications, great. I mean, whatever you use for an air supply,
At one point, those were cheaper than the compressor that you bought.
probably.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you can buy one like that for 89 bucks.
The next question regarding the compressor is, what do you need to add to it, this type, for use?
I have no idea.
Well,
Moisture trap.
that was my question. The smaller one, like, you've got to have a moisture trap on
Yep,
it.
I'm
But
going
as
to
you
talk
said,
about that.
Around here, we don't really need it. And you're right, we drain these things and you blow the moisture traps in the tank, basically.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. Well. Okay. So I can kind of. I don't want to skip ahead to those yet, but we're going to talk about those in just a second. The next thing that I want to talk about that comes off of your compressor is just like 4 different types of hoses that we can use for airbrushing. All right, and I will get back to that. All right, the hoses that we use for airbrushing, 4 different options available. We have a vinyl hose that comes with most of your starter kits. I've seen a few of them floating around today. That's these right here. These thin little vinyl hoses. Very popular with, like I said, these starter kits that come out. They're only rated probably 60 psi. Nice little hose. You flex them too many times, they might break on you. The other one's a recoil hose. Kind of the same design as this, but it's pretty much just like this. It recoils. It kind of stays out of your way. If you're in a tight area, you don't have a lot of room to work, it's nice to have a hose that's just going to recoil up on you. It doesn't lay on the floor, kind of like this. You're not stepping on it. It just stays out of your way and recoils. Clear hoses, same thing as this, but clear. Now the clear hoses, those are mostly used in a high moisture area. The bakery industry uses them. They want to see if anything's coming through the line before it gets to the cake or whatever they're spraying. So here's the vinyl hoses on the screen. A couple of different, there's one exactly like that right there. Those are starter kit hoses. Here's an example of a recoil hose. Like I said, it's nice if you're in a confined area. It just kind of stays out of your way. Those are also rated about 60 psi. And then this is a picture I found of a clear hose. That's mostly high moisture areas. You don't want any, the last thing you want is I don't know if it's ever happened to anybody, but you're spraying something and you blast pass, and it's the most beautiful paint job you've ever done. And you're so proud of it. There's no dust on it, no bugs have landed on it yet, and it's your last pass and water comes through and it just beads up on the last pass. Hate it when that happens. So same thing with like the bakery industry, that's what they're looking for, Last thing we want to do is have moisture come through. So that's what that hose helps prevent. And then the world champion, of course, is our the braided hose. These are rated at about 100 psi. Very strong hose. They make them so they don't crimp on you the way they're designed. They're crush proof. I'm sure you could, but it's a rubber inside and it's vinyl. Braided. Very durable. You could tow a car with it.
Sounds like you don't
You need it too. But a braided hose is the choice. It's one of the best choices to make when you're airbrushing. It'll last you a very long time. Very rarely will this hose fail on you. Very durable hose.
Well, actually, what the cost, as you say, the cost is probably worth investing in that because you won't have to invest in another one.
Well, the nice thing about these hoses now, you buy an airbrush, they come with a hose.
Yep.
I have a blue, right here. This airbrush came with this hose.
My Badger came with
Yeah,
it.
so it's nice nowadays when you buy a new airbrush kit, a lot of the companies will supply the hose.
That's the way this came out.
Yeah. So it really, you know, if you think about it, the cost of these isn't really that much. Now, if you bust one and you buy another one, I'm not sure, probably 30 bucks, if that, for a nice braided hose. So,
External.
you know, the hoses, it all depends on what you're doing. If you're a beginner and you got a beginner kit, you're gonna end up with a vinyl hose. If you wanna upgrade yourself and become more advanced with it, go with a braided hose. It'll last you a long time, probably never have to replace it. That being said, we'll get into like regulators, gauges, and moisture traps. Is what you were asking about that. I'm not really sure how. Good luck. So when you have your compressor, the nature of the beast, it creates heat, and heat will create moisture. Ideally, you know, you want to get your moisture trap, and the regulator on this one is down on the bottom.
Did that come with the?
Yes. So they have this right next to the compressor, just for packaging purposes when they shipped it to me. Ideally, you want to get your moisture trap at least 18 inches away from your compressor. A lot of stands have the compressor regulator slot where you control. On this one, I control my air here. Most of your regulators are on top, and you pop those. What you do is you actually pop this up, adjust your air, and push it back down. And that kind of locks it in place. So depending on what kind of airbrush you're using, single action or dual action, siphon feed or gravity feed, you're going to want to adjust your air pressure. And that's what this is for. And like I said, you know, you create the heat in the compressor, you want to kind of get this away. If you're around here this time of the year, not critical, but like I said, if you're down in Miami, Florida, where it's a high moisture area, you want to get this away from your
You might have
compressor.
that problem here, around here in the summertime though, in the cellar.
Exactly. Certain times of the year around here definitely be a problem. I have never had to spray moisture out of this moisture trap yet. And it has the little pin right here. I've never had moisture build up in this thing yet, and I use it, like I said, all the time.
Was it just a fitting, get that on the side of it?
Yeah, so what you'd want to do is just get a brass tube or something and thread it, you know, get the same thread pattern and just kind of move it away. You could probably hook it up with a hose if you wanted to. I don't know why you couldn't do that. So that's your regulator. Like I said, my adjustment's on the bottom. Most of them nowadays are on the top. That's another style there. And then you have your PSI gauge, which is mounted usually somewhere on your regulator. Now, nice thing about these is they come in all different shapes and sizes as well, but I'd recommend getting something that you can fine tune that has 2 PSI increments. Some of them come with 5 PSI, 10 PSI. You can't really fine tune that way. When we're dealing with 8 PSIs and 20 PSIs and 15s and 12s, depending on what kind of product you're spraying through your airbrush, it's nice to have a gauge where you can fine tune your airflow. I don't know what kind of PSI increments are on that, probably.
Well, it goes up to 220 pounds.
So,
I mean, because you can inflate tires, you can run a
What's the
power tools.
What's the increments on?
It's like 5
5 PSI increments.
PSI, you go 20, 25, 30, 35, 40.
You probably
So,
put a second gauge in line with it down.
yeah,
Yeah,
Well,
that's
you had
easy.
one of those
Yeah.
Air traps,
air,
water
moisture traps with the gauge on it. And
Yeah,
yeah,
no
you
problem.
could probably do something like that. Depends on what kind of PSI you're going to be, you know, using.
put it on a quick disconnect.
Yeah, yeah, QD.
I could have told you how he hooked his up when I saw the end of the hose. It's the same way I do. That's all right, I'm not picking on you, Don. I use the same thing. It's not that one, but same idea.
So all your regulators, they all, like I said, work the same. Turn the dial, adjust your air pressure, lock it in, done. Moisture trap does exactly that, traps moisture. I've never had to do that with this one yet. I'm dying to try it though. All right. The other thing is your gauges. 2 psi would be nice. It's not necessary. 5 psi, you could probably get away with that. Any questions about this?
The only other thing I have about the
I got one more thing.
moisture trap
Yep.
is you basically have to get those through an airbrush manufacturer as opposed to a compressor.
No, well,
You can go to Home Depot and get
that's a good question. You know what I talked about? You can have secondary moisture traps. Tanks on, if this was sitting on
Yeah.
top of a tank, on a high moisture area, high humidity place, you have this as a primary, your tank's a secondary. You can put an inline, what's called an inline moisture trap on your hose. It's a kit you can buy, it's like 15 bucks. Cut your hose, follow the instructions, put the moisture trap in. The biggest thing with the moisture traps when you do an inline is you want to make sure your moisture trap's hanging vertically and that the water drains at the bottom. I don't have any examples of that, but let's say if this was a little inline, you'd want to make sure that it's vertical and that your water drains at the bottom. Otherwise, you don't want it like this is not going to work properly.
Well, you said something about, I've seen kits, as you say, to connect onto your holder for your airbrush.
Yeah.
And it's right there at your tip, and that keeps it vertical, so.
Correct. That's where you put your regulator
Yeah.
and your moisture trap. A lot of these holders now come with that kind of thing. So out here, if it's June, July, August, I think all we really need out in this area is just one moisture trap. If you're out in Tucson, Arizona, probably don't even need a moisture trap. Miami, Florida, different story. So,
Eric?
yes, John.
Compressors,
Yep.
are there, different types of compressors? The diaphragm versus something else?
Well, yeah, but pistons, there's a lot of this. I don't know if they're more expensive or not. I'm not too familiar with piston-style compressors because I airbrushed and I've used a diaphragm the entire time I've learned how to airbrush. It'd be something worth researching online. I'm not sure of the cost, but I know the maintenance involved might be more not worth it than. Because don't you have to oil those? You're familiar with
No,
that?
well, you have to keep the oil up, but my experience, the oil compressors, I have one of each. And I got the diaphragm for up north because I keep moving it around. You move an oil compressor around, it's got to be level, and you're going to have to set it down and wait a half an hour before you turn it on.
They're becoming.
They are cheaper, basically.
Yeah.
But I think their downfalls way outweigh the fact of the couple extra bucks you're going to pay for a diaphragm. The diaphragm is.
I would probably
just-
agree with that. Yeah, for what we do, I don't know if the hassle's worth it.
I mean, I can't even move my oil one from my garage to the barn without having to let it sit, John, for about 45 minutes before. And I'm trying like hell to keep it level. You're gonna slosh that oil around, and if you try to turn it on, you're gonna stall your compressor because it's gonna try to push the oil and it won't do it.
Sounds like more trouble than what it's worth.
$75 jobs.
Yeah, well, you're not gonna.
Is that oil or is that diaphragm?
That's diaphragm.
Yeah. I think that's one of the most popular things now. It's just a diaphragm compressor. They're quiet now.
They're all set?
Okay.
That's one thing you're scared about a diaphragm is, like mine up north, I'll plug it in this spring and hopefully the diaphragm hasn't got too crispy over the winter because it's freezing. But anyhow,
I think the diaphragm compressors now are quiet enough. I mean, we can get away with using those.